Hi guys, so this month we're going to explore debates about violence and the issue of violence. Now this is something that you debate a lot, but not just you, that society debates a lot, right? Because violence is something that is quite innate in terms of human civilization, if you want to put it that way. If you look back through history, there's always examples of violence. In every culture all around the world, there are examples of violence. Now, violence used on the individual level, on a societal level, violence in entertainment, violence in sports, violence everywhere. Okay? So we're going to explore a few different debates about violence, and beginning with the debate about violence in punishment. And I think this is the most common use of violence. Maybe not the most common in terms of where you're going to get it or be exposed to it the most, because there's a lot of violence in entertainment and in media, and we're going to look at that in the next week. But most common in the sense of the debates that you will do most often. You're going to debate a lot about violence in punishment. And it's one of those areas where people feel more clear-cut about violence. You can get somebody who's like, an 80-year-old grandmother who's nice and kind and loves her children and watches very friendly soap operas, but she will strongly support using violence when punishing someone, be it punishing kids or punishing criminals who do terrible things, right? So it tends to be one of those things that a lot of people agree on, yet also discuss from a very kind of emotive level, because we're not really sure that violence and punishment is 100% effective. I mean, if it was, then we wouldn't really have many crimes, right? Let's get down to the debate, okay? So, and I think that's like the first big clash, because in any issue, when you discuss violence, the major disagreement will be one between the side of utility, right? Is that violence useful? And if that violence is useful, then that violence can be justified because there is a purpose for that violence. That violence has a utility. And we tend to justify many bad things or things that we feel bad about based on the utility, right? So this is a utilitarian or consequentialist ethical framework. On the other hand, there is a morality or a moral, an innate good and bad to something. So if you think that that thing is bad, that thing is bad. Even if that thing has a utility, then that thing is bad, right? Because you shouldn't be doing it. So even if, killing, and you can take this to an extreme, right? So if I kill brutally many people, and anybody who has the chance of doing something wrong, then therefore that is the highest level of utility. But that doesn't seem like it's something that most people will be comfortable doing, right? If you killed all poor people, you killed everybody without education. If you killed all men, then the world will be a much more peaceful and safer place without men. So utility on its own isn't really enough. There needs to be a bit of a balance. And there is a bit of a dance between these two things, right? To how much utility is required in order for something to be moral, or something that is immoral or something that is controversial needs to have a huge, powerful impact in order for that thing to be justified, right? And you see this in debates about torture, for example. Because people feel really bad about torture, but you get this very powerful utilitarian rhetoric that will justify torture. The ticking time bomb, and we need to do this, and if we don't do this, then thousands of people will die, and many of those people will be children who will die. And so we need to torture. And that's where the powerful utility will come from, right? But depends whether you want to buy that or not buy that. Okay, but let's break it down a little bit more. So when we talk about utility, there is protection. That is the big utility, right? Stopping people from getting hurt. There is deterrence, which is future protection. So deters or discourages people from doing the crime. You can also show a rehabilitative impact from using violence as a form of changing people, right? And especially debates about using violence with youth or children. People talk about how they can learn from violence, not so much when people are adults. And finally, there is a retributive utility. So this shows equates two kind of bad things together, right? And it's a kind of revenge, does harm onto someone proportionate to the harm that person has done to someone else or to society in general. And that's also a distinction that is often made in debates about punishment or crime, that it isn't really about harming that individual, because sometimes the individual is dead and doesn't exist anymore. It can be about the family or about society, right? And that's why the state punishes someone, not that individual punishes someone else, because the criminal is committing a crime against society, and therefore society, as represented by the state, has the power and the obligation, some will say, to punish that individual, right? So these are all the utility of it. And if there is really good utility, meaning you are saving people and you're doing ethical things for the society and proportional things for society, then that increases the morality of your actions, right? But you can also discuss morality on its own. Maybe retribution is moral, depending on your framework of morality, right? In many religions, or even from an ethical perspective, people have this eye for an eye, quid pro quo, to create equality and proportionality. So if you get to feel the harm that you cause onto other people, whether or not you can feel or cannot feel, because some will argue if you're a psychopath, you can't really feel anything. But from a moral framework, then maybe it's fair, right? That's fair that there is this violence that is done upon you, proportionate to violence that you have done upon other people. So that's one way to think about morality. And in discussing morality, you also talk about how morality extends and to who morality extends, and who can be expected of morality, right? So some people have an argument when you discuss rights, rights has to be understood equally by different people. And the reason why maybe we don't offer some rights to children or to animals is because they don't have the capacity to understand or act upon those rights. In the same way, you can talk about extending morality to individuals. The individuals need to deserve morality, need to participate within a framework in which they respect morality, and if individuals don't, then they don't deserve that morality. They've excluded themselves from the moral framework and therefore don't deserve morality. But is morality based on the person who's receiving that morality or the person who's giving the morality, right? So it could be a reflection more of yourself rather than of other people. So I become more or less of a moral person, and that's what's important, not whether or not the other person understands whether the action is moral or immoral. So even if like it's an animal or a child, then I shouldn't harm them because I'm committing something that is immoral. It's a little bit funky ideas here, right? And it may be a little bit convoluted, but that's why it's interesting. And you should think a little bit more about this trade-off between morality and utility, right? So to kind of summarize and step back a little bit, you need to justify the violence and the role violence plays in punishment. On one hand, there is the utility, and on the other hand, there is the morality, and there is a relationship between these two things. Okay, and there is a scale to what extent the morality or utility will travel. In the middle, this will obviously depend on the different types of violence. The more violent the act, the more utility you need to show. If it's not very violent, very, very soft, then maybe you'll accept the morality of it for lower utility. Okay, so that's the trade-off between violence and punishment. Let's get a little bit more specific. So these are some debates where we can see this trade-off, right? This is a classic of banning the death penalty. On one hand, death penalty, very, very violent. The most violent thing a state can do to its individuals, to its citizens, except perhaps torturing them. It's something that lots of states commonly do, even some very, very advanced and developed states. So on one hand, is it useful? Is it not useful? There's some evidence to show. A lot of evidence shows actually that it isn't. Some evidence shows that it maybe is. But with a lot of death penalty debates, a lot of states maintain it because they feel it is necessary and they feel that it is fair, right, to do it. Then you have this one, a policy of targeted assassination of gang leaders. Now this sounds like an incredibly hardcore policy, and it actually is, right? So this is one of those things where it's super violent and you need to show a high level of utility. And if that violence can be really, really useful in terms of protecting society and lowering the net amount of violence that society suffers, then maybe it is useful. So this is kind of like the debate about torture. You will create a lot of checks and balance towards these things, and very exceptional situations in which you use them. And you've talked about the context of gang leaders, why it is similar to another context where you would use violence, for example, like in war, right? You're trying to assassinate or destroy your opponent who is causing harm to your population. And if you can draw that parallel, then you can pull off this debate, right? So a lot of debates about violence also rely on you painting this context. I need to show that the environment kind of demands it. And finally, we have this debate about police officers using non-lethal weapons. And this is the debate we will discuss. So let's get into this debate. Here we go. So, that this house believes that police officers, if you say it too often, then it becomes confusing. Police officers should only use non-lethal weapons. So this is a very relevant debate, especially the time that we're doing it now in the context of America, where there's been a rise in incidences, or at least reporting of incidences, of where police officers have used lethal force on individuals. But it's also something that happens a lot, and actually even more in like the developing world, right? If you look into crime statistics in Mexico or Brazil, right, or whichever country that you're in, well, sorry, I shouldn't say that, it's overgeneralizing it, but in, say, like the country that I'm from, like in Malaysia, you have many situations where a lot of unexplained deaths because police officers end up shooting criminals. And it's a very tricky situation because it's hard to assess whether or not that shooting was deserved. There's a lot of public trust placed upon police officers, and you need to. If you don't trust them, they can't do their jobs. Yet sometimes these people end up dying, and it looks really dodgy, right? Like in the case of Michael Brown, or Tamir Rice, like this little kid who was shot by a police officer because the kid was carrying a toy gun, and the police officer thought that was a real gun and then shot this 12-year-old kid. So in some of the situations you go like, oh, maybe that doesn't seem like that should have happened, and it could have been prevented if the cop wasn't holding a gun, right? So that's the context that we're going to discuss. Now, so that I kind of talked about that here, right? So the problem of militarization, police officers end up becoming more and more heavily armed, and there used to be a distinction between police and SWAT, and SWAT is like the Special Weapons Action Task Force or something, and these are the guys who are super militarized, right? So they are almost like the army. You have, in most countries, you have the police, which have the highest interaction. So do that there, right? Police, highest interaction with people, and then on the other hand, you have the army that don't really do day-to-day stuff. That is annoying me. Here you go, army. That if they don't see anybody most of the time, it's fine. But when they're called into action, they're called into the most hardened, violent, hardcore, extreme situations. And in the middle, sometimes you have, special forces. You have the SWAT, you have, some people have like some special heavy action, special duty task force. And then there is like maybe, a scale. So even in the army, you have SEALs or guerrillas and et cetera, and police, you have traffic cops, you have people on the far end of the spectrum. Okay. So it's good to present this as a bit of a spectrum. And this debate is about people in this level of the spectrum, right? People who engage with the day-to-day citizens the most. And at least that's how you portray the debate. So you're not saying that there's never a need for special weapons, but you don't think everyday police officers should be carrying these guns, should have the ability to end a life as part of their everyday jobs, right? We think that's just too much, probably not even necessary. So that's the first thing you need to make in this debate. There's a distinction between the police and SWAT, or Special Actions Forces. And you say like this debate is about police officers. So traffic cops, people who are doing like the day-to-day stuff, people who, you see in the streets, the patrol cars, people are driving around most of the time without a real urgency. So in a special situation where you think there may be a need for it, so you need to bust into like a criminal's house, there's a call for like an armed robbery, a bank robbery, then you send the special police forces or the slightly higher level ones who have guns, right? But at the end result, not every police officer will be carrying guns on the street, and that will be still a significant change from the status quo, okay? Then you talk about the problem of militarization. Police end up getting more and more guns, and when you see the police in the streets carrying like machine guns and all of these things, there really isn't a necessity for it. Now, this may not be the police in Korea, but when you go to like America, it's a little bit scary, right? And your regular citizens are not armed like, crazy militants. So we don't need to have militarization. And the context, I think, is primarily America, but there's also a global context. I think this applies to countries like Mexico, Brazil, maybe even the Philippines, let's take it there before I generalize too many countries. But you paint that context a little bit. Now, you can't say, don't pick countries that are safe where police officers don't do this, right? So police officers in the UK, in Japan, in Korea don't, as a matter of habit, always carry guns. And that's good. So that's the kind of norm that you want, and you want to change the other countries to become like this norm, okay? Because what we want safer, stronger societies. And that's your challenge in this debate, show that societies can become safer. Let's get to arguments. So I've come up with 3. I'm sure you can come up with more. The first one, the right to use lethal force. That's my favorite and most interesting one, which I'll get to in a minute. The second thing is on better alternatives. And that's something you need to do in this debate. You need to show that cops without guns can still stop bad people who are going to harm them, and even if those bad people have guns. And finally, effective policing requires trust. And this is your long-term become gooder, better, sunshiny world argument, right? So first one, right to use lethal force. Now, talk about the context of an everyday police officer. So now you're not saying nobody can use force whatsoever, because you still are okay with SWAT. You can take a position on the death penalty, say death penalty bad, or even if you think death penalty may be required in some situations. The debate isn't really about whether anybody can use violence. It's about whether these individuals should be able to readily access violence, right? All the time. And that's an important distinction. So if they feel like they need it, like I'm going to go into an area that's armed shooting, I'm not saying these guys should run in anyway, right? They can call for backup, and backup should be readily available. But maybe they shouldn't be running in every way with their 38 revolvers, because that's going to harm them, or Glocks or Berettas or whatever it is, because that's going to harm them even more. This could be even more dangerous for them, right? So talk about that context. Say, in terms of these everyday, like police officers, wow. I got excited talking about cops. They shouldn't be using guns. Do they have, number one, should they have the power to do that, right? And you talk about why it's very subjective. Because you haven't really done a full assessment of the threat. Now, if I know that there's shootings and there are guns happening there somewhere, I've talked to a few people, I call someone else, they make an assessment, someone comes, right? And people come specially trained for that situation. If I'm an everyday beat cop, my training isn't SWAT training. My training is, I can train to use the gun and so on, but I'm also trained in most other things, and I'm supposed to be an approachable figure for the people. Now, if I'm carrying a gun and I feel threatened, that threat is subjective, right? If I see someone who's bigger than I am, who to me looks threatening based on my cultural understanding of threat, maybe because of my background and my environment and where I'm from, and because I'm a small guy who used to be bullied a lot by these type of people who are big and like jockey or look a certain way, then I'm going to feel a lot more threatened, okay? So threat is subjective. If I'm really big and really bold and I don't feel threatened. So because there's so much subjectivity involved, these individuals shouldn't have this right? Because it's really hard to assess whether or not it's used in a consistent and safe way. And also, given that, there are insufficient checks, right? How do we actually know that that person was under threat. At the end of the day, you have to take the police officer's word for it. And that is when it becomes really, really dangerous. Okay. So talk about the subjective levels of threat. And this is where you can extend into how it leads to things like racism, because people's cultural, perspectives, there is a wide, perception that maybe people of a certain race are more dangerous than people of another race. And some racist cops may shoot them, which is what, has happened. Okay. But regardless of that, say how, because it's so individual, like you put that person in a very kind of high pressure situation, it's very subjective, and that doesn't lead to these, not enough oversight. Okay. So that's the first one. And therefore that person should have the right to use lethal force. Secondly, talk about the alternatives. That because the person still needs to do their job, there are many, many alternatives which will allow them to stop someone else and not harm them, not kill them. Well, harm them maybe, but not kill them, right? So these are things like tasers, the electric shock guns, right? That shoot like a little electric plug attached to a wire and then touches you and then it shocks you. And that stuns and stops people. Now, too much tasering can kill someone, but you still have a lot more leeway compared to shooting. Very little shooting can still kill someone, right? Then you have rubber bullets, you have pepper spray. Okay, so a lot of these things can be used to stop threats, and gives you a lot more leeway, right? So if I only have a gun, and I need to use the gun, there's a lot of pressure on my judgment, and because if I make a mistake, the person's dead, right? But if I don't make a mistake, I could be dead, or someone else could be dead. So I need to act. And if I'm going to err on the side of caution, I'm going to shoot that person, right? And maybe shoot them in the leg or the arm or whatever, but it requires much high level of precision. And if I really want to stop them and I really feel threatened, I'm going to shoot them in the chest and they're going to die. But if I have a taser or rubber bullet or pepper spray, I don't have to take such of a gamble. If I tase the wrong person, then they're going to be hurt, but they'll still end up being okay. Okay, so talk about why these alternatives are better, both in the sense that they can stop, right? So show how tasers and all these things are effective, but also they're safer. And that makes them better. That makes them more usable, actually, than guns. Last but not least, talk about effective policing. And expand this term policing, right? So a lot of people think of policing as just like stopping bad guys. But most of what police officers do aren't just that. Police officers engage with individuals, help them, kids who are lost, people who may be doing something bad. If a police officer can talk someone out of a violent environment or situation or doing something bad, then that's far more effective policing, right? If you can break up a fight or you can prevent someone from getting into a violent situation, that's really effective policing. And so that requires trust. That requires you not looking at everybody like someone who could kill you. Instead, looking at them as people that you can protect. And that will bring the police officer and the people closer together, which makes the people trust the police officers more because you know that they're not going to shoot you and kill you, right? So you're going to be a little bit more thoughtful and kind and warm and, maybe hug them a little, I don't know. And change the orientation in the minds of the police officers. Rather than the moment they see you put my hand on my gun and be like really ready, I've got to, approach from a more conciliatory, peaceful perspective. Okay? So those are the arguments on the Gov side. You want to reframe the paradigm of policing to create more trust and talk about why putting them in that situation is unfair to the police officer, but, also to the people around them. Right? So don't do this all cops are bad routine because it's not true, number one, but it's also not sustainable because at the end you still need police officers. So it's strategic to run this case. It'd be most strategic to run this case in a way where you can be on the side of the cops. Show how this is good for policing, good for police officers, putting too much pressure on them by giving them guns and making them make this judgment call. But let's go to opposition. So opposition, here's our context. Opposition, you'd be a bit more hardcore, right? Opposition, you're like, we gotta trust police officers. Police officers are the shit, the bomb. I mean, the good people, and we can't be suspicious of them all the time, right? So, but at the same time, you can concede that sometimes, some things may happen, but that comes with the nature of the job. So we need better training for police officers, right? But we also police officers need all the tools that they need. Okay? So, and yeah, that's the thing. They need to have every options that they possibly need. So it should be up to the police officer to decide. What we want to do is to empower the police officer. You don't want to say that I don't trust you to make the decision. You want to say that I want to prepare you the best that I can so that you can make the decision, right? To create more mature, independent, powerful police officers. So don't use the guns all the time, but have the guns in case you need to use the guns. And that's the position on the opposition, because you need to protect the police. So in the opposition, your context is of a more dangerous society. And if the audience buys this context that society can be more dangerous, then you'll win, right? So you need to show that necessity part in opposition, and then show how you can use this to protect society. So it's not just about protecting the police, right? If society is more violent, then that society is going to harm other members of society. So even if a couple of police officers end up dying by the hands of criminals, they need this more to protect bad people. Well, not protect bad people. Protect people against bad people. Yes, not protect bad people. I'm thinking of bad cops. Okay. Opposition arguments. The first one, responsibilities require rights. Secondly, necessity, and this is a big one. And thirdly, the message that cops are weak and untrustworthy, right? And I think this is also like a powerful emotive argument that you can run on all. But number one, if we're going to give police officers a huge responsibility of protecting society, then we need to give them rights. And this is a direct clash with the other side's first arguments about rights. So you can say that it is very subjective, yes, but we need to trust them. If you don't trust them, they won't be able to do their jobs. And because some people fail doesn't mean that you need to remove trust from everybody. Most of them do a great job most of the time. What we need to do is to get other people to become like them, right? And then develop greater responsibility. So, and that's your position around the police. So there's a lot of pressure on police and high expectations on them, and we put them into the most dangerous situations. And if you want police officers to keep doing this and to do more of it, we need to trust them more and give them more rights. And how this gun and this ability to use lethal force, I'm not saying they should use them all the time, but the option to use lethal force needs to be theirs, okay? And then you move on to the second one, and that will tie in nicely. Why the non-lethals are not enough, right? So you can, in here you can do like this non-mutual exclusivity thing, right? So you can say that, yep, okay to tasers, okay to rubber bullets, okay to all of these things, it's fine, right? But we also want to have guns. So the police officer can have both. You can tase first and then you can shoot, right? Depending on your context and on your situation. So it doesn't have to be like, we're not saying that they shoot all the time, but the onus is on the gov to show why you never, ever need guns. And we're going to say sometimes you will, but you have to show how the police officer can be trusted to make the right judgment call in every or most of these situations, okay? And that's where you need to talk about the training and your context and all those things. Okay, so in specific situations, you can talk about why the non-lethals are not enough just because you don't have enough stopping power. Just like how things are subjective, people react subjectively to tasers or rubber bullets or pepper spray, of all of those kinds of things. And truth is, nothing stops like a gun, right? And guns not just stop individuals, they can also harm cars, they can also harm other things. If you're trying to stop a speeding car, for example, shoot out their tires. I can't tase a car now, can I? Depending on where the tasers land, the effectivity can be different. Like if you're wearing thick clothes, it may not be as effective, but bullets tend to go through most clothes. So you can give some context where these non-lethal weapons are not enough. And more than that, you have to remember talk about when not just heavy gang drug war stuff, because that's when the SWAT will come in, but on a day-to-day basis, right? That I could chance upon a violent crime, a bank robbery, carjacking, hostage situation, something. And in that situation, I need to be prepared. And that's what I want. I want every police officer to have greater ability rather than have specialized police officers, right? So I want every police officer to do some kind of SWAT-like stuff. Not full on, they don't have to carry bazookas and shotguns, but at the very least they need to have a gun. Okay? So again, that comes down to your framework on op. You have to paint this slightly more dangerous world. And if people believe that the world or the context when you're talking about is more dangerous or can be more dangerous, right? Then they're going to believe that we need this model of policing. On the other side, they'll say that you can talk about a cycle of danger. Like if your police are more armed, then people are less likely to cooperate with them, and people feel the situation is worse than it actually is, and they're less likely to create more peace, right? So that's going to go back and forth a little bit. Last but not least, I think this is a powerful argument that you send a message that cops are untrustworthy. And this leads to societies that don't trust the police. Okay? Now, regardless of whether they do it now already don't trust the police, this is only going to make it worse. If the message is, I'm not going to give police guns because I don't think they can be trusted to use it, are people really going to depend on the police to save them? Right? You say that that's not going to work. Instead, what we need is more training, more accountability. If a police officer misuses a weapon, send the police officer to jail, have more transparency, better oversight. But the answer is not to take away guns from every police officer, because that will just harm cops and police in general. Okay? Good. So that's the position on op. I hope we've covered both these cases sufficiently. You can come up with other stuff, right? But don't forget the big picture. And the big picture here is about using violence in crime and punishment, right? Both in the scale of an individual level. Is violence effective in changing someone's behavior? Is violence effective in deterring people from committing crimes? Is violence effective in reforming individuals, right? Changing them? And is violence effective in making society feel better and retributing the amount of harm that someone has caused to someone else? But even if violence is effective in doing all of these things, is it morally justified? Or is it morally justified because it is effective in doing all of these things, right? So, very interesting debate about the role of violence in crime and punishment. One I'm sure that you will be coming or experiencing a lot. Well, good luck and happy debating about violence and punishment.